There's a story that begins with a simple promise and ends in complete confusion. A man stands before a judge. He has been sentenced, but his sentence is unusual. The judge tells him, "You will be hanged at noon on one of the weekdays next week. But the exact day will be a surprise. You will not know it until the executioner knocks on your cell door." The man listens carefully. He doesn't panic. He's clever, maybe too clever. He goes back to his cell, sits on his narrow bed and starts thinking. He begins to reason. If the hanging were to happen on Friday, he says to himself, then by Thursday night, if I were still alive, I'd know it must happen the next day. But then it wouldn't be a surprise. The judge said it must be a surprise, so it can't be Friday. He pauses. If it can't be Friday, then what about Thursday? Well, if Friday is out and I'm alive on Wednesday night, then the only day left would be Thursday. That means I'd know it's coming. That wouldn't be a surprise either, so it can't be Thursday. He keeps going, day by day, and by the time he's done, he has logically ruled out every single day of the week. He smiles. He's beaten the system. The judge's words, he thinks, are impossible. There is no way for the execution to be both a surprise and a certain event. He goes to sleep that night feeling safe, intellectually safe. And then one morning, the executioner knocks on his door. It's Wednesday. He's shocked. Completely, utterly shocked. And in that instant, as his heart races, he realizes the judge was right. The hanging was a surprise. The paradox lives right there, in that moment, between logic and life. How can something be both impossible and real at the same time? The unexpected hanging paradox isn't just a trick of words. It's a confrontation between human reasoning and the limits of what reasoning can predict. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to know something? What does it mean to expect it? And can logic ever truly contain surprise? Because, logically speaking, the prisoner's argument makes perfect sense. Each step of his reasoning is sound. If Friday is eliminated, then Thursday follows, then Wednesday, and so on. Step by step, he walks himself out of danger. But the world, as it often does, refuses to obey pure logic. What went wrong? Was the judge's promise a lie? Was the prisoner's logic flawed? Or does this paradox reveal something deeper, something about how we understand time, knowledge, and expectation itself? Think about what surprise means. A surprise depends on your state of mind. It's psychological, not purely logical. It's not just about what can happen. It's about what you believe will happen. The prisoner, through reasoning, convinced himself that execution was impossible. And that very belief, his absolute certainty, is what allowed the surprise to exist. In other words, his logic created the conditions for his own shock. That's the first twist in this paradox. Reason didn't save him. It betrayed him. But it gets even stranger. Because when philosophers started analyzing this paradox in the 1940s and 1950s, they realized it wasn't just a puzzle about a hanging. It was a mirror held up to logic itself. It exposed a hidden tension between what we can prove and what we can know. In philosophy, that distinction is everything. A statement can be logically true, and yet psychologically false. It can be provable, and yet unknowable. It can exist, but be impossible to expect. That's where the unexpected hanging sits, right at the border between logic and the human mind. To really understand it, we have to slow down. Let's look carefully at what's happening inside the prisoner's reasoning, and what's happening outside it, in the mind that reasons. When he says, "If I'm alive on Thursday night, it must happen Friday," he assumes that his logic on Thursday night will be the same as it is now. He assumes that future knowledge will be consistent with present reasoning. But knowledge doesn't work that neatly. What if, on Wednesday night, he's still uncertain? What if uncertainty itself is the key? See, the paradox plays a trick on us. It makes us think knowledge is something we possess, like an object we can hold. But it's not. Knowledge is a process, always moving, always fragile. And expectation lives right on its edge, the boundary between what we know and what we can't know yet. When the executioner knocks, the prisoner doesn't just die physically. He dies logically. His reasoning collapses in an instant. And yet, paradoxically, that collapse proves the judge's statement true. It really was a surprise. This isn't just a story about a man and a noose. It's about every moment in life when we think we've got things figured out, and reality steps in and says, "No, you don't." That's why this paradox is so haunting. It doesn't just question logic. It questions certainty itself. Because sometimes, the more certain we are, the more blind we become. And sometimes, the only real surprise is realizing we could still be surprised. When philosophers first encountered the unexpected hanging paradox, many dismissed it as a curious word game, a clever trick in reasoning, like a puzzle meant to amuse rather than unsettle. But the more they looked, the more it began to reveal a deeper unease. It wasn't just an oddity. It was a warning sign, a glitch in how logic and knowledge intertwine. The prisoner's reasoning, on the surface, is flawless. It's almost mathematical in its precision. He moves step by step, eliminating each possible day with perfect clarity. He starts with Friday, then Thursday, then Wednesday, and so on. Each argument solid, each deduction undeniable. By the end, he concludes that a surprise hanging is impossible. And yet, the hanging happens. The surprise is real. His logic collapses not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't complete. It's a strange thing to say, that a logical argument can be both sound and false at the same time. But that's the essence of this paradox. It doesn't expose a flaw in reasoning itself. It exposes the limits of reasoning as a model of reality. You see, logic is a language. It describes relationships between statements. If this, then that. But what the paradox does is blur the boundary between logical truth and psychological truth, between what is and what is known. The judge's sentence isn't a mathematical statement. It's a prediction about knowledge, about what the prisoner will or won't know in the future. And that's a dangerous thing for logic to handle. Because logic isn't built to talk about itself. The moment knowledge becomes self-referential, when we start reasoning about reasoning, the ground beneath us begins to crack. Let's pause there for a moment. Imagine trying to predict not just what will happen tomorrow, but what you will believe about tomorrow when tomorrow arrives. That's what the prisoner is doing. He's not predicting the hanging itself. He's predicting the state of his own mind. And the problem is, the mind is not a fixed object. It changes as new information arrives. Every deduction he makes today depends on what he will know or not know in the future. And that's something logic can't measure. That's the first fracture. Logic assumes that facts remain constant. But the mind doesn't. This paradox takes advantage of that. It lives in the gap between what's true and what can be known to be true. In the prisoner's chain of reasoning, each link makes sense on its own. But the full chain, the entire argument, depends on a circular assumption that his own future knowledge will follow the pattern his current logic predicts. In other words, he believes he can outthink his future self. He believes that by reasoning now, he can eliminate every surprise later. And that's where his downfall begins. Philosophers call this kind of reasoning a self-referential loop, a logical structure that turns inward and begins to devour itself. It's the same kind of loop that appears in another famous puzzle, the liar paradox. The sentence, "This statement is false. If it's true, it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true." The statement collapses under its own weight because it refers to itself. The unexpected hanging is like the liar paradox brought to life, turned into an event that unfolds in time. Instead of a sentence contradicting itself, it's a prediction that contradicts the very knowledge used to make it. The prisoner's logic fails not because he's irrational, but because he's too rational. He treats human knowledge like a sealed system, something that can be fully mapped. But the mind isn't a system, it's a moving target. Every act of reasoning is a moment in time, a snapshot of understanding. And by the time we finish reasoning, the world and our mind have already moved forward. The unexpected hanging forces us to see that movement. It's like trying to stand still in a river. You can map the current, predict its flow, but the moment you step in, you change it. Your presence disturbs the water. In the same way, the prisoner's act of reasoning changes his expectations, which in turn change the outcome. That's the paradox's quiet genius. It traps logic inside its own reflection. The deeper philosophers looked, the more unsettling it became. Because this isn't just about prediction. It's about meta-knowledge. Knowledge about knowledge. Can you ever truly know what you will not know? Can you predict your own surprise? And if you can, does that mean it stops being a surprise? These questions reach beyond logic. They reach into epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge itself. In the 1940s, when this paradox first appeared in academic circles, philosophers realized it shared DNA with something that had shaken mathematics to its core only a decade earlier: Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel proved that any consistent mathematical system, one that avoids contradiction, will always contain truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. In other words, there will always be statements that are true, but unknowable from the inside. That's exactly what happens to the prisoner. The truth of the hanging exists, but it cannot be known within the framework of his reasoning. His logic is internally consistent, but incomplete. Gödel's work showed that no system can be both complete and consistent. The unexpected hanging shows us the same about human knowledge. No mind can be both completely certain and completely open to surprise. The two cannot coexist. If you know everything, nothing can surprise you. If you can be surprised, then by definition, you didn't know everything. And yet, Life demands both. We need enough knowledge to survive, but enough ignorance to stay curious. Enough control to plan, but enough uncertainty to grow. That balance between knowing and not knowing is where meaning happens. In that way, the paradox becomes not just logical, but existential. It mirrors something fundamental about consciousness. We are creatures that crave predictability, but are sustained by mystery. We long for certainty, yet are shaped by surprise. Every relationship, every discovery, every leap forward begins with the same contradiction. We move toward what we don't yet understand. And maybe that's why the unexpected hanging feels so eerie, because it's not just about a clever judge and a doomed prisoner. It's about the human condition. It's a portrait of the mind reaching too far, trying to outthink the very fabric of experience. There's another angle to this paradox, one that connects it to the psychology of belief. When the prisoner convinces himself that execution is impossible, he experiences a kind of peace. He stops worrying. He's confident that the judge's statement is empty. And yet that very confidence becomes the mechanism that makes surprise possible. The moment he stops expecting, he becomes vulnerable. His certainty blinds him. That's the emotional counterpart to the logical loop. Certainty and surprise are inversely connected. The more certain you are, the more devastating the shock when you're wrong. This principle shows up everywhere. In finance, in politics, in relationships. When you believe the world will behave exactly as you've predicted, the universe finds a way to prove otherwise. It's not malicious. It's natural. Because systems, like people, evolve in ways we can't always foresee. The unexpected hanging captures that beautifully, almost poetically. It's a paradox of timing, of awareness, of the delicate line between what's true and what's realized. Some philosophers have tried to solve it mathematically, using modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity. They argue that the paradox only appears if we assume perfect rationality, perfect knowledge, and perfect language. But no real human mind operates under those conditions. We don't reason like machines. We reason like humans, with uncertainty, emotion, and bias. That means the paradox, when stripped of its logical formalities, becomes a metaphor for consciousness itself. Think about it. The judge represents reality, unpredictable, yet lawful. The prisoner represents the mind, orderly, yet blind to what lies beyond its rules. And the surprise hanging? That's the encounter, the point where reality punctures expectation. It's the moment where thought meets experience, where prediction fails, and understanding begins. In that moment, something strange happens. The paradox resolves itself, but not through reasoning, through revelation. The prisoner's logic was airtight, but incomplete. The hanging completes it. It's as if the paradox had to be lived to be understood. That's why this idea still resonates decades later, because it suggests that not all truths can be found through thought alone. Some must be experienced. Some knowledge only exists on the far side of surprise. And maybe that's the true power of the unexpected hanging. It humbles us. It tells us that intellect, as brilliant as it is, cannot capture the totality of life. It shows us that the limits of logic are not a failure. They are an invitation. An invitation to accept that uncertainty is not the enemy of truth, but its partner. So when we return to that cell, to the prisoner sitting in the dim light, counting days and reasoning his way into safety, we see ourselves, each of us, trying to plan the future, trying to outthink fate, trying to eliminate surprise. But the hanging, the moment we could never predict, waits quietly, reminding us that life will always contain the unexpected. And maybe that's not a punishment at all. Maybe it's the only thing that keeps us awake. When the prisoner is finally led to the gallows, something remarkable happens. For one brief instant, before fear sets in, he realizes that everything he believed to be impossible has happened. His logic, his confidence, his carefully constructed walls of reasoning, all of it has dissolved in the face of reality. And in that silence, as he looks back on the week that just passed, he understands something profound. He had never been in control. Not really. That's what makes the unexpected hanging paradox so powerful. It takes the idea of control and turns it inside out. It reveals how the human mind clings to certainty like a life raft, and how reason, in its attempt to master the world, can actually blind us to it. Because what the prisoner wanted wasn't simply to survive. It was to know, to predict, to stay one step ahead of fate. But fate doesn't negotiate. And the more he tried to reason it into submission, the tighter its grip became. That's the hidden message of this paradox. Control, no matter how refined or intellectual, is always an illusion. We try to control everything: our schedules, our relationships, even our emotions. We predict, plan, and strategize. We convince ourselves that if we just think carefully enough, prepare thoroughly enough, we can eliminate uncertainty. But uncertainty isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system. It's built into the structure of reality. The unexpected hanging is not just about knowledge. It's about surrender. About what happens when we discover that the very tool we use to protect ourselves, our reasoning, can also be the source of our downfall. It's unsettling, yes, but there's also something liberating about it. Because if we accept that surprise is inevitable, that not everything can be known or predicted, then we stop fighting the flow of life. We stop trying to make reality obey our mental models. We begin, slowly, to live with uncertainty, instead of against it. In that sense, this paradox is a lesson in humility. It reminds us that no matter how intelligent, how rational, how self-aware we become, there will always be truths we can't reach by thought alone. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's the point. Let's step back for a moment. In philosophy, the unexpected hanging has been studied as a problem of logic. But in a more human sense, it's also a problem of existence. Because every one of us, in some quiet way, lives under the same condition as the prisoner. We all know that our lives will end someday, but we don't know when. We are told, by nature itself, that our ending will come, and yet it will always be a surprise. That's the existential version of the paradox. We walk through our days reasoning, planning, predicting, as if our own mortality was something theoretical, an event we can think about, but never truly expect. And when it arrives, no matter how much we've prepared, it shocks us. The same logic applies. If we knew the exact day and hour of our death, it wouldn't be a surprise. But since we don't, we live as though it will never come. That's how we manage to keep living, with the illusion of permanence, wrapped in the logic of denial. The unexpected hanging becomes a mirror for that, a reflection of our delicate balance between knowing and ignoring, between fear and acceptance. It's not a story about punishment. It's a story about being alive. And in that light, the prisoner isn't just a man waiting for death. He's all of us, standing on the edge of uncertainty, trying to think our way into safety. But here's the strange thing. If surprise is unavoidable, maybe it's not the enemy. Maybe it's a gift. Think about it. Every genuine moment of beauty, of connection, of discovery, begins with surprise. The child seeing snow for the first time, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the realization that someone loves you or that you love them. None of those can be planned. They can only happen when life catches you off guard. So perhaps surprise isn't something to eliminate. Perhaps it's something to protect. The unexpected hanging shows that logic cannot contain surprise without destroying it. Because to predict a surprise is to cancel it, to rob it of its essence. And yet, surprise is what makes experience alive. Without it, we would live in a perfectly predictable world. Safe, but lifeless. No change, no growth, no discovery, just static certainty. That's not life. That's repetition. So when the judge promises a surprise hanging, it's not a trick. It's a kind of parable, a symbolic reminder that the essence of life is not in the things we can predict, but in the moments we can't. That might sound poetic, but it's also practical. Every major breakthrough, in science, in art, in human understanding, begins as something unexpected. Penicillin was discovered by accident. Electricity was first observed by curiosity, not by prediction. Even love, creativity, and inspiration follow this pattern. They appear when logic loosens its grip. In that way, the unexpected hanging isn't a warning against logic. It's a reminder of its boundaries. Logic can describe the structure of the world, but not the texture of it. It can measure the parts, but not the meaning. The prisoner's mistake wasn't reasoning. It was assuming that reason could account for everything. He believed that what couldn't be logically explained couldn't exist. But existence is larger than explanation. Reality doesn't need to fit within our proofs to be real. There's a quiet, almost spiritual dimension to that realization. Because if we stop trying to predict every outcome, if we allow for the unexpected, we begin to notice things we otherwise overlook. The texture of uncertainty. The small surprises that punctuate our days. The awareness that mystery isn't chaos, it's depth. When the executioner finally knocks, the prisoner experiences terror, but also clarity. For the first time, his mind stops reasoning. It simply is. And in that silence, he understands something that his logic never could. That not knowing is part of knowing. That acceptance can coexist with awareness. And in a strange, paradoxical way, that realization is a kind of freedom. Because when you accept uncertainty, you stop being its prisoner. When you stop demanding that the world always makes sense, you start to see it for what it is. Unpredictable, yes, but also infinitely rich. There's another way to interpret the story. The judge represents not fate, but reality itself. Unyielding, but fair. And the hanging is not a punishment, but an awakening. It's the shock that shakes us out of our illusions. It's life reminding us that we're never as certain as we think we are. You see, paradoxes are not just logical knots, they're mirrors. They show us where our language, our beliefs, our sense of control stop making sense. They mark the edges of the map, the place where knowledge gives way to wonder. And that's what makes the unexpected hanging timeless, because it doesn't just question logic, it questions us. It asks, what do you really know? What do you expect? And what would happen if, just once, you stopped expecting and simply lived? Maybe that's what the prisoner never understood, that the surprise wasn't the hanging itself. The real surprise was realizing he had spent his final days trying to outthink life instead of living it. We do that too. We get caught in the same loop, overanalyzing, overplanning, trying to calculate happiness, as if joy could be scheduled like an appointment. And then, when something unpredictable happens, we call it chaos, when in truth, it's just reality, reminding us that we're alive. So perhaps the final message of the unexpected hanging isn't one of fear, but of release. We cannot escape surprise, but we can learn to welcome it. We cannot predict everything, but we can choose how we respond when the unexpected arrives.